Boyfriend assumed he'd spend Christmas with my family. I said no. He got upset, we argued, I stood my ground, we found a compromise. And now he's my fiancé and part of my new holiday traditions. Christmas has always been a big deal in my family. Not just the usual tree and presents kind of big deal, but the mom starts planning the menu in August, and dad has a spreadsheet for the gift budget kind of big deal. Every year we do the same thing. Christmas Eve at my grandparents' house, Christmas morning at home with my parents and siblings, and then a huge dinner that includes extended family, friends, and occasionally a stray neighbor who didn't have plans. It's loud, chaotic, and honestly one of my favorite times of the year. This year, however, my boyfriend of 2 years, Jake, assumed he'd be part of it. And by assumed I mean he didn't ask. He just casually mentioned in November, "So I'll come over after breakfast, right?" As if this had been prearranged. I hesitated before answering, and I guess that was his first clue something was off. Actually, I was kind of planning on doing Christmas the way I always do. His face immediately fell. Without me. Here's the thing. Jake and I have very different views on the holidays. His family barely celebrates. Christmas is just a reason for his mom to buy a new scented candle, and his dad to complain about traffic. They exchange a couple of gift cards, eat takeout, and call it a day. No judgment, but that's not how I do Christmas. And the idea of squeezing him into my family's plans? It didn't sit right with me. Not because I don't love him, but because my family has a very particular rhythm. There are inside jokes, traditions, and roles that have been established for years. I don't want to play host, make sure Jake isn't overwhelmed, and explain to my aunt for the 10th time who he is while she's 3 glasses of wine deep. I just want to enjoy the holiday the way I always have. So I told him as gently as possible, I just really want to have Christmas with my family. It's special to me. But I'm part of your life, he countered. Don't you want me there? Of course I do. But I also want one day, just one, to be simple. No logistics, no compromises, just the same Christmas I've had every year since I was a kid. He was clearly hurt. So I don't even get invited to dinner? I hesitated again. Not this year. Cue an argument about how couples are supposed to blend traditions, about how his family barely celebrates so he has nothing else to do, and how it sucks to feel like I don't want him there. I felt bad, I really did. But I also knew if I gave in just to make him happy, I'd end up resenting it. He finally said, "Well, I hope you don't expect me to come to your New Year's party then," as if that was some kind of punishment. And honestly, that's fine. But now I'm wondering, am I a bad person for refusing to spend Christmas with him? Should I have just invited him to dinner and sucked it up? Or is it okay to want to keep some traditions untouched, even in a relationship? After our argument, things got tense. Jake wasn't outright giving me the silent treatment, but there was a definite shift. Fewer texts during the day, less enthusiasm in our usual conversations. When I brought up weekend plans, he shrugged and said, "I don't know. You probably just want to spend it with your family." Oof. I was determined not to let guilt make my decision for me, but his mood was making it hard. So I did what any reasonable adult would do. I called my best friend Claire for backup. After I finished my rant, she was quiet for a second before asking, "Okay, but let me ask you this. Do you see yourself spending Christmas with him in the future?" I sighed. "Probably, yeah. But not this year." "Then tell him that," she said. "Reassure him this isn't some I don't take you seriously thing, it's just, you're not ready to change your traditions yet." That's fair. So I took her advice. That night, I sat Jake down and tried to explain it differently. "I love you and I see us having Christmases together in the future," I told him. "But this year, I just want it to be like it's always been. It's not about not wanting you there. It's about wanting one last holiday that feels the same before things change." He still wasn't thrilled, but I think he got it. "I just don't want to feel like an outsider in your life," he admitted. And that was the root of it, wasn't it? So I made him a promise. "Next year, let's figure out a way to do Christmas that works for both of us. Maybe we split time, maybe we host something of our own. But this year I need this." In the end, he accepted it. He made plans with a couple of friends for Christmas Day, and even sent me a photo of himself in a ridiculous ugly sweater, so I knew he wasn't just sitting alone sulking. And my Christmas? It was perfect. The same chaos, the same bad holiday movies, the same ridiculous board game arguments over whether my brother was cheating. And when I saw Jake the next day, he hugged me and said, "I get why you love it so much. I don't know what next year's Christmas will look like. Maybe it won't be exactly the same. But I do know one thing. I made the right choice for me. And sometimes that has to be enough." As January rolled around, things between Jake and me went back to normal. The tension had faded, and we were back to our usual rhythm. Lazy weekends, inside jokes, and arguing over what to watch on Netflix. I could tell he was still a little sensitive about the whole Christmas thing. But he wasn't holding a grudge. Then, in late February, something unexpected happened. Jake casually mentioned that his mom was thinking about hosting Easter brunch, and had invited me. "You don't have to come," he said quickly, like he was bracing for another rejection. "I know Easter isn't as big for you as Christmas." I could tell this was his way of testing the waters, seeing if I was willing to make an effort for his family's traditions, even if they weren't as big as mine. And honestly, it was an easy yes. "Of course I'll come," I said. "Just tell me if I should bring something." The relief on his face was obvious. When Easter came, I showed up with a homemade dessert, because you can't go wrong with dessert, and did my best to fit in. His mom was sweet, his dad made bad dad jokes, and his younger sister grilled me about when Jake and I were getting engaged. It was casual, low-key, and surprisingly nice. After brunch, as we were walking to the car, Jake reached for my hand. "Thanks for coming," he said. I squeezed his hand back. "Thanks for inviting me." And in that moment I realized something. Relationships are a give and take. I had needed one last traditional Christmas with my family, and Jake had respected that. Now it was my turn to show up for him. That summer, when we started talking about the holidays again, we approached it differently. Instead of him assuming he'd be at my family's Christmas, or me insisting on keeping my traditions the same, we actually sat down and figured out a plan. We decided that this year, we'd do Christmas Eve separately. He'd see his family, and I'd keep my tradition of going to my grandparents' house. But Christmas Day, we'd spend it together. Maybe with my family, maybe just the two of us. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I don't want you to feel like you're giving up your traditions." "I'm not giving them up," I told him. "I'm just making room for something new." And honestly, that felt right. Because love isn't about keeping things exactly the same. It's about growing together. And this felt like the perfect way to start. December rolled around again, and I won't lie, I felt a little nervous about the new plan. I knew spending Christmas Day with Jake meant things would be different, and while I was okay with that in theory, part of me worried I'd end up feeling like I'd lost something. But when Christmas Eve came, everything was just as I remembered. My grandparents' house was packed, my dad's Christmas playlist was blasting, and my mom was in full holiday host mode. I ate way too much, laughed with my cousins, and even managed to win our family's brutally competitive Christmas trivia game for the first time ever. And the best part? I knew I still had Christmas Day ahead of me, but in a new way. The next morning, Jake and I had our first ever Christmas together. It was simple, just the two of us in his apartment, still in pajamas, exchanging gifts over cinnamon rolls and coffee. And you know what? It was nice. Cozy. Different, yes, but in a good way. Later that afternoon, we went to my parents' house, and surprisingly, it didn't feel strange to have him there. He fit in, joking with my brother, helping my mom in the kitchen, and even playing referee when my dad and uncle got into a heated debate over football. At one point, I caught my grandma watching us with a knowing smile. When I raised an eyebrow at her, she just winked and said, "You're making new traditions now." And I realized she was right. That night, as Jake and I left, he slipped his hand into mine and asked, "So, was it okay?" I smiled. Yeah, it was more than okay. And it really was. Because Christmas wasn't just about tradition. It was about the people you share it with. And as much as I loved my old traditions, I was starting to love the idea of building new ones too. As we drove home, snow starting to fall outside, I looked over at Jake and thought, this might be the start of something really special. The following year, when Christmas came around again, I didn't feel nervous. In fact, for the first time, I felt excited about blending old traditions with new ones. Jake and I had settled into a rhythm, Christmas Eve with my family, Christmas morning just the two of us, and dinner at my parents' house. And honestly, it worked. This year, though, something felt different. It started with little things. Jake being extra thoughtful about gifts, his nervous energy when we were around my family, and the way my mom kept smiling at me like she knew something I didn't. But it wasn't until Christmas morning, when Jake handed me one last gift, that I really understood. I unwrapped the small box, heart pounding before I even opened it. And when I saw what was inside, a delicate gold ornament in the shape of a ring, tied with a little ribbon, I froze. Jake cleared his throat, suddenly looking as nervous as I felt. "I know how much your traditions mean to you," he said, "and I want to be part of them. Not just this Christmas but all the Christmases after this." Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a real ring and dropped to one knee. I didn't even let him finish his speech before I blurted out, "Yes." That night, when we went to my parents' house for dinner, I barely made it through the door before my mom shouted, "Let me see the ring," which confirmed my suspicion that she had definitely known something was up. My grandma pulled me aside and gave my hand a little squeeze. "Told you," she said with a wink. "New traditions." And she was right. Because Christmas didn't look exactly the same as it used to, but it still felt like home. And now I was building a future where every Christmas after this would be even more special, because I'd be spending them with the person I loved. And that's how I learned that traditions don't have to stay the same to be meaningful. Sometimes they just have to grow with you. Next story. My dad stopped talking to me because my boyfriend has long hair, ignored me, called only when I got a promotion, still refused to accept Jake, so I realized I don't need his approval and walked away for good. I never thought my relationship with my father would fall apart over something as simple as hair. But that's exactly what happened when he found out my boyfriend, Jake, wore his hair long. For as long as I can remember, my dad was the kind of man who believed in firm handshakes, short haircuts, and respectable appearances. He used to drag my brother to the barber every 3 weeks like clockwork. The idea of a man with long hair? Completely unacceptable in his world. When I introduced Jake to my parents, I knew there would be some resistance. Jake isn't just a guy with long hair. He's a 6-foot-tall, tattooed motorcycle riding artist. He's also one of the kindest, most intelligent and hardworking people I've ever met. But to my dad, all he saw was a hippie who needs a job and a haircut. Never mind that Jake actually runs his own small business selling handcrafted furniture. The introduction dinner was brutal. My mom was polite, trying to keep things light, but my dad? He barely acknowledged Jake. He spent most of the meal making passive-aggressive comments like, "Back in my day, men took pride in looking like men." Jake, to his credit, just smiled and ignored it. A few days later I got the call. "I can't support this," my dad said, his voice tight with anger. "I raised you better than this." "Better than what?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Better than dating some guy who looks like he hasn't showered since the 70s. I was furious. "Dad, you don't even know him." "I don't need to," he shot back. "If he cared about being a man, he'd cut his damn hair." And that was that. He stopped calling, stopped answering my messages. Even at family events, he would either ignore me or refuse to come if he knew Jake would be there. It was as if my choice to date someone who didn't fit his image of a proper man was a personal betrayal. It's been a year now, and things haven't changed. My mom still calls, still visits, but my dad? Nothing. I used to think time would soften him, but so far it hasn't. And the worst part? I don't think I care anymore. I spent so much of my life trying to live up to his expectations, but if something as trivial as a haircut was enough to make him stop talking to me, maybe he never really saw me for who I was in the first place. A year into my dad's silent treatment, I started to wonder if there was even a point in trying to fix things. At first, I held on to this hope that he'd come around, that one day he'd realize how ridiculous he was being. I pictured some grand moment where he'd call me up and say, "I was wrong, sweetheart. Bring Jake over for dinner." But that call never came. Instead, every family gathering turned into an awkward negotiation. My mom would call me weeks in advance, trying to plan around my dad's stubbornness. "Maybe you and Jake could just stop by after he leaves?" she suggested once, as if we were scheduling shifts at a diner instead of a family Christmas. The worst part? My dad was fine with pretending I didn't exist. He'd go about his life, hanging out with my brother, visiting my cousins, showing up at birthdays, just never mine. I should have been heartbroken. And I was, at first. But then something strange happened. I realized I didn't miss him as much as I thought I would. See, growing up, my dad and I never really talked. Our relationship had always been surface level, built on things like, did you finish your homework? Did you clean your room? Why are you wearing that? There were no deep conversations, no heartfelt moments. He showed his love through rules and expectations, and the second I stepped outside those expectations, he cut me off like I was a bad investment. Meanwhile, Jake knew everything about me. My fears, my dreams, the stupid little things that made me laugh. He listened. He saw me. And for the first time I started asking myself, why am I fighting so hard to be accepted by someone who clearly doesn't care about who I actually am? That question sat with me for months. Then out of nowhere my dad called. It was the first time I'd heard his voice in over a year. Hey, he said. No hello, no how are you? Just a gruff, almost reluctant hey. I waited. I wasn't going to make this easy for him. After a long pause he sighed. Your mom said you got a promotion. I blinked. That's why he's calling. Not to apologize, not to acknowledge everything that had happened, just because I did something that fit into his definition of success? Yeah, I said flatly. Another pause. Then, that's good. Proud of you. And that was it. No mention of Jake. No acknowledgement of the past year. Just proud of you. I should have felt relief. Maybe even happiness. But instead I felt exhausted. Because I realized in that moment that this was the best I was ever going to get from him. He wasn't calling to reconnect. He was calling to check off a box in his mind. Daughter is successful. Can resume minimal contact. I let out a slow breath. Jake and I are getting a dog, I said, testing him. Silence. Then the sharp edge in his voice. You're still with that guy? And that was all I needed to hear. Yeah, Dad. I'm still with that guy. I could almost hear his jaw clench. Well, he muttered. Hope that works out for you. I smiled to myself. Because you know what? It is working out for me. It's been 2 years now since my dad decided my boyfriend's hairstyle was more important than our relationship. And honestly, I don't think about him much anymore. Some people like to say that family is everything. That blood is thicker than water. But I've learned that real family isn't about blood. It's about the people who love you without conditions. The ones who see you, accept you, and stand by you, no matter what. And if my dad can't be that kind of person, then I'm better off without him. A few months after that last call with my dad, something happened that really cemented my decision to move on. Jake and I had been talking about getting engaged, and one night, over a completely chaotic dinner of takeout and half-empty wine glasses, he casually pulled out a ring. No big speech, no grand gesture, just him sitting across from me, looking at me like I was the most important thing in his world. And I realized that was all I ever wanted. It was easy to say yes. We didn't rush into wedding planning. Instead, we spent time just being, laughing in our tiny kitchen, taking road trips with our new dog, figuring out how to build a life together that felt like ours. Meanwhile, my dad remained a ghost in my life. My mom still called, still sent holiday invitations, still updated me on family gossip, but his name rarely came up. And I didn't ask about him because I already knew the answer. He wasn't coming around. Then one day my mom called with a hesitant, "Honey, your father wants to talk to you." I almost laughed. About what? She hesitated. He heard about the engagement. I leaned against the counter, staring at the ring on my finger. Of course. Not a word for 2 years, but the second there's a wedding, suddenly he has something to say. I told her I'd think about it. And I did. For a whole 5 minutes before realizing I already knew my answer. I texted him instead of calling. Hey, Mom said you wanted to talk. I don't think that's a good idea. Hope you're doing well. He never replied. And just like that, the final thread between us snapped. At first, I braced myself for guilt. I waited for the regret to creep in, for the second guessing, for that nagging voice in the back of my head telling me I should have handled it differently. But none of that came. Instead, I felt free.